My talk is entitled The Intelligent Design Movement, How Intelligent Is It? I want to first of all just briefly go over an overview of where we're kind of going with this so you can kind of see. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal journey and how I've been involved with the ID movement because I think it helps maybe you to understand a little bit better where I'm coming from on this. Definition of the intelligent design movement, I'm just going to refer to it as ID for just brevity's sake. A history and explanation of the ID concept, how we tell if something's designed or not, what the movement is and isn't, problems with the movement, and solution. Now, about 5 years ago, I really felt a call to figure out what I believed and why I believed it. Now, although I had grown up in a Christian home and been to a Christian church pretty much all my life, I really didn't, I don't think, have a good understanding of the origins issue. And the Lord really laid on my heart the verse in 1 Peter 3:15. Always be ready to give an answer for the hope that you have. And I could tell people the gospel message. That was no problem. I could definitely do that. But a lot of the people that I had to deal with when I was in graduate school at Ohio State, they were evolutionists. They didn't believe in God in the first place. What good does it do to tell somebody the gospel message if they don't even believe in God? There's no foundation for what I'm about to tell them. And we had a very ardent evolutionist down the hall from where I worked in graduate school, and he would very emotional, and he would come in all the time telling us all these wonderful evolutionary facts. And I never got into it with him. I was scared. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what I believed and why I believed it. So the Lord said, you need to figure this out. So at the outset, I thought, okay, I'm going to go out. There's going to be all these scientific evidences to support a particular viewpoint, whether it be 6 days, thousands of years, millions of years, whatever. That's what I'm going to go out and do. And the very first book that I picked up was Michael Behe's Darwin's Black Box. And I was just fascinated by this book because it dealt with molecular and cellular biology, which is my area of specialty, and basically supported the existence of God without the Bible, just through science alone. And I found this to be very intriguing. And so got more interested in the movement, read about it, checked out their website a lot, gave a seminar on it to my students the following year, and just really thought this was a really interesting viewpoint. However, it didn't ultimately lead people to Christ, and that's what I wanted to do. They don't mention, we'll talk more about this later, they don't mention who the designer is. They don't bring the Bible into it. Well, obviously I believe the Bible, so how did all that work with the origins issue? And that following year, basically, I went to a conference, and at that conference, the most meaningful lecture to me was a lecture on the meaning of the word yom. Okay, now that may not sound too exciting, but it gave all these evidences for why yom meant a literal 24-hour day. Well, that was just very eye-opening to me. And as soon as I heard that, I thought, well, that's it. That's what God said. That's enough for me. I don't need to know anymore. If God said it was created in literal 6 24-hour days, and I know Genesis to be a historical narrative, then that's the way it has to be. That's the way it is. And so from there, I really started to get involved more with Answers in Genesis and ICR, and really reading their literature and going to their conferences and understanding the whole younger creationist viewpoint. Now, when I got involved in this, what I started to realize was it wasn't that there was a bunch of scientific evidences out there to support a particular viewpoint. Rather, it was all about my presupposition. How did I look at the world? Did I look at the world through the Bible, or did I look at the world through man's theories? If I looked at the world through the Bible, everything fit together. We had creation, we have corruption, we have the cross, we have the consummation. It all fit very, very nicely. One thing led to another. One thing gave the foundation for the next, and that made sense to me. But when I looked at the world through man's theories, I realized that if millions of years were in the past, that meant death, pain, suffering, disease, all of those things. That all had to happen before the fall. And I thought, wait a minute. it's not just about what God says about science and nature, but it's about what science and nature say about God. And what does that say about God? What are the theological implications of what you believe about origins? That it's very, very important. They both talk about each other. And I realized I can't believe that, because that does not fit with the God I know. That does not fit with the God I have a relationship with. And so it spoke to me even more that why this origins issue is so important, why our presuppositions and how we interpret the evidence is so very, very important. Now, why do I think it's important to really understand the ID movement? Probably a lot of you have heard about it. It's getting a lot of publicity. It's in the media. If you have children in school, you may have heard about it, because it's something that is definitely entering the realm of education. And in opposition to Darwinism, can we question Darwin's theories in public schools? And I think it can play a role. I think it can play an important role. But I think we need to be very, very careful with it and how we deal with the ID movement. So let's first talk about what ID actually means. And this is from the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture, which is sort of a think tank for the ID movement. They say on their website, the theory of ID holds that certain features of the universe and living things are best explained by an intelligent cause, not an undirected process such as natural selection. Now, two things I want to point out about that. Certain features, okay? Not everything by an intelligent designer, just certain things. And we're not going to name who the intelligent designer is, okay? It's just an intelligent cause, okay? Very, very vague. And that's going to be important to remember as we go throughout this. Now let's talk a little bit about the history and sort of an explanation of the ID concept. Where are they really coming from with this current movement? Because usually there's nothing new under the sun, all right? And so this is just, what we're going to see is a reiteration of some things that have gone on in the past. What many people are referring to the current ID movement as are more of a refurbished natural theology. Now, what is natural theology? Natural theology took place mainly, it was an idea or a movement that happened back in the 18th and 19th centuries, and it's probably best explained by what's called the watchmaker analogy, which was really publicized by William Paley. It was his idea. He said, if you were in the forest and you came across a watch, okay, and you picked up that watch, you would not think that it just happened, that it came from all the elements around it, but instead that somebody had intelligently designed it. It's too complex to have just happened, and it has a purpose, so therefore it has a designer. Okay, that was his idea. So it was basically a knowledge of God apart from the Bible. That's what they sought to do, more of a general revelation versus a knowledge of God from the Bible, which is more or less a special revelation. Okay, so that's why they did that. Now, why did they want to do that? Why did they want to prove the existence of God or support the existence of God without the Bible? Well, it was really a reaction to the higher criticism of the Bible that started in the late 1700s. And they were reacting to that, because higher criticism basically means a bunch of people that didn't believe the Bible in the first place trying to say it wasn't true. And so that's what higher criticism is. And so they sought to do this, and so these people said, well, we can't have God disappear off the scene, so instead, let's try to support his existence through other means. Now, obviously, God says, we know from Romans 1:20, that we can know him through his creation. And that is very important, but special revelation is more important, and we're going to talk about that. Back in this time period, in the 18th and 19th centuries, they really didn't have a lot of the scientific evidences that we have today. They had more philosophical evidences for a designer. Things were beautiful. Things had a purpose. They studied the human body a lot. Those were the types of evidences that they had. They really had more of what I call philosophical evidences, not really scientific evidences. But then you get into the late 1800s and the 1900s, and you see an absolute explosion of biology on a small scale, okay? You see microbiology, the golden era in the late 1800s, people understanding that disease was caused by germs, by bacteria and viruses into the 1900s. In the 1950s, you see Watson and Crick come up with the structure of DNA. In the 1970s, you see recombinant DNA technology analogy. And so you have this absolute explosion of scientific evidence. You've opened Pandora's box, okay? You've opened the cell. It's not a blob of nothingness, which is what they used to think. There's a lot more to it than that. So now we have all these scientific evidences for a designer. We need a designer, an intelligent designer, now more than ever, because now we actually have not just the philosophical evidences to back it up, but the scientific evidences. So the current ID movement really started in about the late 1970s with Charles Thaxton and went up to, and obviously is going on today. And it's basically a refurbished natural theology. Some of the major players are Johnson, Behe, Dembski, Denton. There's a whole list of those individuals who are involved, who have written books and are involved in this way of thinking. Now, I just wanted to share this quote with you. It says, although cloaked in the mantle of science, ID is nothing more than the argument offered by the natural theologians of the 1800s. Organisms and features of organisms are machine-like in their complexity. Human-produced machines are designed, therefore organisms must also have been designed. So he's saying, again, a lot of people are recognizing this person doesn't necessarily like the ID movement, but he's saying that's what it is. It's nothing new under the sun. Now, let's just kind of summarize it before we go into a little bit more complexity here. It's a very common sense, logical approach to science, okay? And what they're going to say, just to use another analogy, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck, okay? If it looks design, then it is design, right? That's what they would say. Now, again, they're not going to say everything is design. They're just going to say certain features are designed, and we're going to talk about that. Now, how are they going to determine what looks designed? Okay? You can't just look at something and say, oh yeah, that looks designed. It's more than that to them. Okay? They have some things that they have to go through to determine that. Now, what they're really going to talk a lot about is irreducible complexity, or something they call specified complexity. These are things that bear the hallmark of design. Not everything, just something. Behe uses the analogy of a mousetrap. That's what he's kind of famous for. And he says it has several parts, and it needs each of these parts in order to function properly. Okay? This is the system. It has several parts. If each of those is functioning properly, you trap a mouse. Okay, hopefully. That's the idea behind it. It works. Now, if any of those parts are removed, the mousetrap doesn't function anymore, and therefore it doesn't catch a mouse. Okay, so that's kind of the idea. Now, that's a pretty simplistic analogy. In his book, he's going to deal with, obviously, biological, biochemical systems. This is just his way of sort of introducing you to the topic. He's going to talk about the biochemistry of sight, how we see, how cilia and flagella are formed, which are structures that move organisms. He's going to talk about just various ATP molecule, an energy molecule. How do you make that? These are really complex biological, biochemical pathways that he's going to apply this to. Now, one of the other examples that he uses is the blood clotting cascade, and that's what I'm going to use today as a more complex example. Now, I am not going to go through this whole thing and try to explain it to you, okay? That's not the purpose of my talk today. But as you can see, just by looking at this, it's very complex. There are a lot of different factors that have to work together in order for you to clot blood properly at the right location at the right time, okay? All of these have to work right. If they don't, you end up with a blood clotting disorder, like hemophilia, for example. And there are several other examples of disorders that come from either missing or mutated clotting factors. Okay? They must work properly in order to clot blood. Now, a lot of people will really, really tear apart Behe's mousetrap analogy. They'll say, you know what, I actually saw a website on this, and I'm not sure exactly how this works, but you can actually build a mousetrap apparently with only 2 parts, and it still sort of catches mice, okay? So they really like to tear that apart. They like to say, well, it's really not valid. You know what I say? You can tear the mousetrap analogy apart all you want. But we're not talking about mousetraps. We're talking about pathways that have possibly hundreds of proteins involved in them to make something function, okay? So they can have the mousetrap. I can deal with that. But they can't have this, okay? They can't tear apart this. They can't tear apart a lot of the other things that he discusses in his book. Now, that's the first half. So these are the systems that we're talking about. Now, why do these need an intelligent designer? Why does evolution not work? Okay, so if we have a very basic understanding of evolution, we say, well, evolution works by small, gradual, successive steps. Okay, that's how we get to the final product, so to speak. It's a constant building. We get a new structure, we get a new function, whatever. It helps the organism survive better in its environment. Now, the other side of that is if it's not functional right then and there, it's gone, okay? It doesn't keep it. Evolution does not believe in keeping leftovers, okay? For the most part, we might keep leftovers, but evolution doesn't, okay? If something is not functional, it's gone, okay? It doesn't keep it. So when you try to apply this to things like the blood clotting cascade, let's say by some miraculous, okay, literally, happening, we got 3 of the blood clotting factors. Okay? Now, we don't have them all, we only have 3. Okay, then in the next generation, all 3 would be lost. Okay, why? Because they weren't functional. Okay, you can't have 3 and have a function. It doesn't work. The other ones are missing. You don't clot blood with 3 factors. So therefore, they're gone. They're out of there. It doesn't work. Evolution is goal-less. It's purposeless. Francis Crick called it a frozen accident. Evolution doesn't think to itself, well, gee, I've already got 3 factors. Maybe if I wait around long enough, there will be the rest of the factors and I can clot blood. Okay? Evolution doesn't do that. It doesn't think like that. It doesn't think in the first place, but it doesn't have the capability of doing it as they're defining it. So you really are sort of stuck. Okay? You can't do that. Now, some people would say, well, there were simpler systems for clotting blood earlier on. And Behe would say, no, that doesn't work. There is no simpler system for clotting blood. So he would say that's not valid. Some people would say, well, these proteins, all these factors were used in other pathways, which, how did they get those? But they were used in other pathways, and they were modified then to work in this pathway. Okay. Number one, they'd all have to be modified at the same time in order to keep the modifications. All right, in order to still function. Number 2, what happens to their function in the previous pathways that they worked in? Okay, so there's some major problems with that. And I always like to say, I may not be a mathematician, but I know 2 + 2 will not equal 5. Okay? It's not going to happen. And so I don't really believe that this is going to happen either. And that's why they would say there's really a need for an intelligent designer. Now, being a molecular and cellular biologist by training, I'm always amazed by the fact that people in that field don't believe in God. I can't fathom it, okay? I literally can't. Just using your common sense, you would have to say, there has to be somebody higher than me. There has to be a being that brought all this into existence. If you look at the blood clotting cascade, this is just one example. And this is a fairly simplistic one. I worked in an area seeing about how cells talk to each other or how within the cell they talk. And this pathway makes all those pathways look, very, very complex. This is one of the simpler ones. And yet, evolution will still say, evolutionists will still say, oh yeah, this is still a hallmark of evolution, okay? Now, I came across this quote, and when I read it, I had to laugh because I thought, I can't believe this. So basically what this individual, Mark Decker, had read a book by an individual who is opposing the ID movement, and his name is Purka. And it says, Purka, a physicist, excuses himself from commenting on the biological aspects of Behe's claim, but instead argues that the concept of irreducible complexity is clearly wrong, and that complex systems actually tend to be overly complex and would therefore be examples of rather poor design. So get this. If it's simplistic, it's obviously evolution. If it's complex, it's obviously evolution. You can't win, right? It doesn't matter what the evidence says. They make it fit their theory, okay? And I had to laugh, like, well, if it's too complex, that must be evolution too. That just doesn't fit with your understanding. That's just not even common sense to say something like that. But, everything, they have to do that, right, to maintain the integrity of what they believe. All right, now, again, we know that this is going to apply to these types of pathways, such as I mentioned, biochemistry of sight, complex biological biochemical pathways. Now, how do we really tell if something is irreducibly complex or it has specified complexity? Design or not? That's the question that they're going to ask. Because remember, they only apply this to certain features, not all features. So how are they really going to decide? Because something can look complex, but not actually be caused by an intelligent designer, so to speak. Okay? Maybe not so much in the sense that we're talking about here, but that's the case, and we'll talk about that, and you'll see what I mean. So let's talk about what they use. And they basically use something called an explanatory filter. And William Dembski came up with this. And I'm going to go through this. Now, this is a very, again, like I said, ID is a very common sense, logical approach. We use the explanatory filter every day. So it basically says there are 3 modes of explanation when you're looking at something. Necessity, did it have to happen? Okay, if it didn't, then that means it's contingent upon something. So is it a blind contingency? Is it chance? Did it happen by accident? Or is it design? Did an intelligent agent cause it to happen? Okay, example. Did she have to fall? No, but she did. Was it an accident? Or was she pushed? Okay. We use this every day. Forensic science uses this every day to figure out who done it. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence, the SETI program uses this to figure out if things from outer space are from intelligent alien life. I'll use an example from my personal life. I'm a college professor, and if I have a student who fails every exam and aces their final, okay, here's the questions I have to ask myself. Did it have to happen? Obviously not, but it did. Was it an accident? Okay, did they fill in the blanks or write their essays by accident correctly? Okay, probably not. Okay, that would be pretty odd. And so the next question I ask is, was there something else involved? Now, I can tell you right now, somebody who fails on my test will not ace my final. Okay? Nobody aces my final. Okay? So I'm going to think, there's definitely something intelligent behind this. Now, it may not be the student that's intelligent, but somebody's helping this student cheat. Okay? So they're having some assistance from somebody who obviously is intelligent to accomplish what they've accomplished. So see, it's something we use every day. It's a very common sense approach. Now, I'm going to use an example that Dembski uses to help explain this a little bit better. And he uses an example from the movie Contact. Now, it came out a few years back, had Jodie Foster in it. And basically in this movie, there was a sequence of radio signals sent from outer space to Earth. And it was a series of ones and zeros, and to be exact, it was 1,126 beats and pauses, with 1 being a beat and 0 being a pause. The sequence represented all prime numbers from 2 to 101. So you can see there's 2 ones, followed by 3 ones, followed by 5 ones. Okay, those are all prime numbers. And they decided that that was proof of extraterrestrial intelligence. Now, had they had Dembski's, now they used Dembski's explanatory filter. Okay, now they may not have said that in the movie, but that's what they used to figure out that this was proof of some intelligent life. So let's go through his explanatory filter. Now, although we're going to go through this stepwise, most likely you would kind of all compile these into one when you look at something. So sometimes it's a little bit hard to separate these because you're looking at it very holistically. At the start, you have to ask the question first, is it contingent upon something? Okay? That's the first question you have to ask. And what we know is that it's definitely radio signals can be received from outer space on Earth, okay? That happens. It's definitely compatible with that happening, but it's not necessarily automatic. There's lots of variations on the signals that can be received. So we would say it's definitely contingent upon something. Now, the next question to ask, okay, what is it? Is it a blind contingency or is it a directed contingency? And it takes 2 questions to answer that, okay? And you'll see what I mean, so bear with me a little bit because most of us would say, well, if something looks complex, then obviously there's an intelligent designer, but we're going to talk about that. Now, what does complexity really mean? Well, I like to say, is there enough of it? Okay? What are the odds on? The more complex something is, the less the probability that it happened by chance, okay, alone. And there has to be something more to it. Now, 1,126 beats and pauses is big. That's a big sequence. Now, if you only received 3 beats and pauses or 5 or 9, you probably wouldn't go running to the radio station with that, okay, or calling anybody up about that. It wouldn't be terribly exciting. But 1,126 in a particular order is pretty amazing, okay, that you would receive something like that. So you would definitely say, yes, this passes the complexity issue. Now, that's still not enough to say whether it's blind or directed, or whether it's intelligent or unintelligent cause. Because what about snowflakes, okay? If you look at a snowflake, you say, wow, that's a really complex structure. Well, I can tell you this much. God is not up in heaven, designing each snowflake and sending it down to earth. Okay, that doesn't happen. Now, he may have set in place the natural phenomena which allow snowflakes to form, but he does not sit up there, cut them out, and send them down. Okay? So while a snowflake looks complex, it actually doesn't have an intelligent cause. Crystals are the same way. They have very complex structures, but they're not actually an intelligent cause. They're just a result of natural phenomena, which again, sort of an indirect intelligent cause there. So we have to ask the next question, which is specification. Dembski likes to say, is it a pattern characteristic of an intelligent agent? I like to say, is it information rich? Does it tell you something, okay? Well, to get all the prime numbers from 2 to 101 in the exact order is pretty amazing. That is a particular set of mathematical numbers. It's not just, evens or odds. It's a particular set. So to get those in the exact order from outer space, you might conclude that yes, there's indeed an intelligent agent sending this particular signal. Okay, there's more to it. It's not just from some astronomical phenomena. There's actually an intelligent agent behind it. So then the last one, yes, it actually is design. So again, it's not just as simple as looking at something and saying, oh yeah, it's complex. They, for example, would say DNA meets all these standards, okay? The blood clotting cascade meets all these standards, okay? It is contingent upon something. It didn't have to happen. It is complex. We saw that by the picture. It is specified because all those have to follow in a certain order and a certain pattern in order to make blood clot at the right time and at the right place. DNA, you can't just put a string of bases together and get a protein out of it. It doesn't work. They have to be a particular sequence of bases in order to make that happen. So that's the filter that they're going to use. Again, remember, they're not applying this to everything, only certain things. Now let's talk about, now that we kind of understand it, let's talk about what the movement is and isn't. Okay, and then we're going to try to get into some of the problems that I see with this and others see with this as well. Dembski says it best. ID is three things: a scientific research program that investigates the effects of intelligent causes, an intellectual movement that challenges Darwinism and its naturalistic legacy, and a way of understanding divine action. Okay, these are what he said, and I agree with him. It's a scientific research program. They're gonna talk about these things. They're gonna allow for the supernatural. Okay, which is in opposition to Darwinism, which does not. For example, Dembski also says design encourages the scientists to look for function where evolution discourages it. Now, they think this is a superior way to do science because you're allowing for the supernatural. You're allowing for a designer. And a good example of that is junk DNA. Okay, and I say that in quotes because I don't really think it's that junky. Junk DNA is the DNA in between the DNA that codes for proteins. Okay, that gives us, the ability to function. Now, if somebody for years and years and years, they thought this DNA, it's so different from organism to organism that there's no possible way that this DNA is important for anything. Okay, if I gave you a sentence and I got no spaces between the words, okay, there's no space between the words, how would you read it? You couldn't, right? It would be very difficult to decipher what I'm trying to say. So junk DNA, they're now finding, amongst other things, it may just be important to be spaces, not the actual sequence, but it may be important just to serve as a spacer between the words, okay, between the proteins. And so again, there's some function to it. It's not just junk. There is a purpose to it. Now, what isn't it? All right. They will not talk about the optimality of design. Okay? They will allow for things to be suboptimal and not explain it. Okay? They will basically just shove it under the rug. They don't want to deal with it. It doesn't explain all designs. Okay? Evolutionary processes are not ruled out. Again, going along with the optimality of design. They allow for suboptimal things because they're not ruling out evolution. It is not religiously motivated. Okay, Dembski says, proponents of ID regard it as a scientific research program that investigates the effects of intelligent causes. Note that an ID studies the effects of intelligent causes and not the intelligent causes per se. ID does not try to get into the head of a designing intelligence. Rather, it looks at what a designing intelligence does and draws inferences from there. Now, what are some of the problems with the ID movement? Okay, I think the single biggest problem is that they divorce the creator from the creation. Okay? Every other problem stems from this one. Okay? You're basically saying, well, God exists, but the Bible isn't there. Okay? We're not going to talk about the Bible. I really like this quote from Michael Powell. He interviewed Philip Johnson, and he said, Michael Powell says, many in the ID movement shy from overt talk of religion, wary of handing a rhetorical gun to their critics, God, Gaia, or super-intelligent alien. They do not presume to pierce the veil of the designer. Okay? They're not going to say who did it. Now, I have a problem with my students in this, okay? Because not all my students believe in a literal 6-day creation. Okay? Many of them don't, actually. And I have a real problem getting through to them and understanding that what you believe about God and what you believe about origins have to be in the same box, okay? They tend to put them in separate boxes, just like our society does. We compartmentalize everything. That's why somebody can be married and have an affair and not think it's wrong, okay? Because we put them in separate areas. They're not somehow connected to one another. And I say, God speaks about nature and science, but nature and science speak about God, and they cannot conflict. Okay, there can't be a conflict, there can't be a paradox, they have to be resolved. It all has to fit together. And so I really try hard to get them to see that, okay, to see that that's a major problem with the way that they are thinking. Now, the next thing they'll say, another problem is ID tends to say we're a very neutral science. Okay? There is no such thing as neutral science. Everybody has presupposition. Everybody has an idea going into it. Okay? Otherwise, there would be no science. Okay? Everybody has a belief system. And so that becomes very, very important to understand, I think. And the thing about it is, natural theology backfired. Okay? Now, why did natural theology backfire? It's okay to recognize God, like Romans 1:20 says, recognize God through his creation. But it ultimately, it doesn't, like, who done it? I mean, that's like the next logical question, right? People ask. Okay, it's okay to say that. It's okay to say, well, yes, this proves the existence of God and or supports the existence of God through science and nature. But what's the next question everybody asks, right? Well, who did it? I mean, if somebody did all that we see, maybe I should be a little concerned about that. Maybe that's somebody I should have a relationship with. Maybe that's somebody I should be responsible to. So what I really see, and what happened with natural theology was that it really backfired because you got this whole reaction of, okay, no Bible's allowed, only human nature and reason. Deism came out of this with Thomas Paine. It's not logical that God would have created the world in 6 days, therefore he didn't. Okay, so that's what happened. You went to the opposite extreme, so to speak, and I don't know that that's where they meant it to go in the first place, but that's what happened. We got totally away from the Bible, totally away from that, and our society loves this, okay, because it's very postmodern, it's very new age, right? Well, you're not saying who the intelligent designer is, so it can be whoever I want the intelligent designer to be, okay? An alien, Gaia, whoever, it doesn't matter, a Hindu god, a Buddhist god, it doesn't matter, whoever I want it to be. And so that fits very well with our current society. Now, there's a variety of beliefs about the intelligent designer within the ID movement. Now, there are evangelical Christians in it. It's not to say that they're not there, but there's also people of other religious backgrounds, and so they can't be unified. There's no way, because they all believe in different forms of evolutionary processes. They all believe in a different God, and so it's going to be very difficult for them to ever have a united front like we do. I mean, we believe in God. We believe in the Bible. We have a united front, whereas they don't. It's very disjointed, and I think that's going to really prove problematic for them. I don't think it's going to make them as effective maybe as they actually could be. Now, one of the last ones I want to talk about is that they're unaccountable for dysteleology. Okay, that's a big word. Let me say what teleology is first. That's a study of design in nature. Dysteleology is a study of the perversion of design in nature. Now, things like pathogenic microbes, viruses that cause diseases, carnivorous animals, death, disease, cancer, mutations, whatever, you name it, those kinds of things. Now, they would name some other things that we wouldn't, like the inverted retina, panda thumb, vestigial organs. They would name those things. But let's just stick to things that we actually agree on are really a perversion of design in nature, that they're not as they originally intended them to be. Now, what's wrong with basically leaving the Bible out of all of this and just saying, okay, God, it's God, he started it, and then left. Okay, what's wrong with that? Well, it was man's choice, not God's choice, that evil entered this world. He made it a perfect world. We destroyed it, okay? We're the ones who brought evil into this world. And so without the Bible, again, what does this say about God? It doesn't say very, very nice things. And, I was trying to think of a really good example of this because often, again, like I've said this a number of times because I think it's really important. What does God say about science and nature? But what does science and nature say about God? Okay, they work together. This is science, theology, philosophy, all of it intertwined. You have to think about all of those things. And I was thinking an example, the earth is only 6,000 years old. We know that from the Bible. But yet we see light from stars millions of light years away. Conflict, right? How does that work? Well, what do we go back to? God's not a liar, right? He doesn't deceive. So there has to be an explanation for it. Russell Humphreys has a book out about that, Starlight and Time, okay? That is how we try to come to an understanding of that. But we ultimately go back to the characteristics of God, the God of the Bible. Who do we serve? Who do we know from the Bible? And so that's really, I think, something that's very important that they have to think about that. Now, we as Christians, though, we can't just say, well, they're bad because they do this. They tend to sweep this under the rug and not be accountable for it, not want to have to deal with it. But we as Christians, I think, do this a lot too. We tend to be very optimistic and sometimes not very realistic. We say, oh, look at the world. Isn't it wonderful? Isn't it beautiful? But it's all been marred by sin, right? This is but a remnant, but a shadow of what things originally were. And so we don't really know what it was originally like. And it has been definitely been marred by sin. So and other people tend to see this. Again, I don't think there's anything wrong with being optimistic, but we also have to be realistic. We have to realize that sin has broken this world. It has broken everything, including all of nature that we see. Although there's evil in the world, we have a solution for that, right? We know the solution for the evil that's in the world. And this is the last problem I'm going to talk about with the ID movement. They may know God as creator, but they do not know him as redeemer. They do not have a solution for evil. And maybe that's why they don't talk about it. Maybe, why would you bring it up if you don't have a solution for it, right? We have a solution for it. We have the answer for that. Philip Johnson says, the problem is not just convincing them, meaning Christian college and seminary professors, that the theory of evolution is wrong, but that it makes a difference. What's at stake isn't just the first chapter of Genesis, but the whole Bible from beginning to end, and whether or not nature really is all there is. It's not just about the beginning, it's about the end of the Bible as well. You can't divorce these two. And this is from someone within the ID movement who's saying this, okay? So they are starting to, again, some of those individuals do realize that this is a problem. Dembski, I love this quote. He says, intelligent design is scientifically unobjectionable. Whether it is theologically objectionable is another matter. And again, he says it's a way of understanding divine action. But what does this say about God? It places him as the author of evil if you don't have the Bible as your framework, as your point of reference. And so it doesn't say very nice things. It's not that we can't know God through the Bible, or God through creation, because we can. Romans 1:20 clearly states that. Man is without excuse, okay? We have to acknowledge God as creator through what he has created. But it's not enough. That will not get you to heaven, okay? In Colossians, what do we see? We see that if you start believing in God as creator, it's natural progression to believing in him as redeemer. And that's what the author of Colossians starts out with here. We see, for by him all things were created, okay? And you continue on, talking about the church and talking about the blood of the cross and how that reconciles all things to himself, okay? It's a natural progression of things. One leads to the other. Without the Bible, like the ID movement, they're not claiming that. You don't have that, right? It stops at that first part. What do you do with evil? What do you do with the dysteleology? In 2 Peter chapter 3, talking about people that stop believing in God as creator, stop believing in the rest of the Bible, right? They didn't believe in the second coming of Christ. They probably didn't believe in a lot of other things. Our society very much today is full of Greeks, right? They don't have a good foundation. They don't have that foundation in Genesis or creation, so what's the point of the rest of it? Like I said, it doesn't do any good to tell somebody the gospel message if they don't believe in God to begin with. You have to start somewhere. You have to have a foundation. And I think the people within the ID movement, sadly, are becoming like what Paul talks about in Romans. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. And I think that's what's really, unfortunately, going to happen. They're saying, yeah, he's there, but we're not really going to talk about him. We're just going to deal with what he did. Right? We're not going to go to that. And again, I think that's very almost illogical, even though they claim to be very logical. It's very illogical. That's a natural progression, a natural question. So what's the solution, okay, to the major problem in the ID movement? It's this. You have to know God not only through his creation, general revelation, but you also have to know him through special revelation, through the Bible. Now, Thomas Aquinas puts this really well. Now, I don't normally have a lot of good things to say, but this is one good thing he has to say. Consequently, for a Christian to engage in natural theology, thereby claiming that it is possible to prove that God exists and is one, does not diminish the fact that it is still necessary to believe with religious faith in Christ, the Trinity, the resurrection, and the forgiveness of sin. By the same token, the acceptance of the conclusions of natural theology does not entail or necessitate religious faith. You got to have them both. You can't just have one or the other. It won't get you to heaven the other way. You have to have Jesus. You have to have the Redeemer. And somebody had forwarded this article to me from the Chicago Tribune, and it was written by Ron Grossman, and he was talking about the ID movement, and he was specifically focusing on the idea of dysteleology, and he was talking about terminal disease in children and babies, and what an awful thing this is to see these babies die of these diseases when they haven't even had a chance to begin life. And it was really interesting to see somebody, and I don't know if I'm assuming he's not a scientist or anything like that, but it was really interesting to read his viewpoints on this. And he really captured what the ID movement says. He says, but this newfangled notion of a designer who lays it out once and forever with no possible revisions, who utters not one word of explanation, who drafted a blueprint and by his silence says, take it or leave it, that's not the kind of creator I want my children and now my grandchildren to learn about. Again, what does it say about God? You have to have the Bible as your foundation, as your framework. God said it, that settles it. I don't care what else you believe about it, that's the way it is. If we start out with that as our foundation, not only does it give us knowledge of God as creator, okay, it gives us knowledge of him as Redeemer. And that, I think, is really the major problem with the ID movement, is not claiming the designer, that it is God, and not using the Bible. Both are very, very important. Thank you.